Welcome to the 2021 Ada County Medical Society Annual Meeting. We have just concluded our member-only business portion of the meeting and want to welcome those from the public who are joining us for the second half of this event. My name is Dr. Thomas Pinto, and I've had the pleasure of serving as the president of the ACMS board this past year. I would like to start by saying thank you to some of the folks who've helped make this event happen through their support. Our title event sponsor for the evening is Idaho Central Credit Union, and they help underwrite the discount for the books that are currently on sale. Our agency partners are also the Boise State University Center on the Study of Aging and the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare's Alzheimer's disease and related dementias health program. Thank you both for helping publicize this event. Before we hear from our keynote speaker, Dr. Jason Karlawish, we are taking the opportunity to honor one of our own tonight. Every year during our annual meeting, we recognize a physician member who exemplifies the best ideals and aspirations of our profession. Dr. Sky Blue has been serving here in the Boise community since 1998. He attended medical school at the University of Iowa and completed his residency at Good Samaritan in Phoenix, where he was chief resident. He then completed his fellowship in infectious diseases and epidemiology at the University of Utah. In 2006, he and Dr. Thomas Kaufman started Sawtooth Epidemiology and Infectious Diseases, which has grown exponentially in the Treasure Valley and serves patients in multiple hospitals and directly through their clinics. He is the medical director of the HIV clinic through the Family Medicine Residency of Idaho and is faculty with the HIV fellowship that is also offered through that program. Dr. Blue has been a stalwart supporter of ACMS through a variety of programs, including educational talks and events, a frequent winter clinics supporter, and a COVID-19 counselor as we have contemplated all of our in-person events this year. Over the past year and a half, Dr. Blue has appeared on Project Echo broadcasts and is frequently within our news cycle. This year, he put his name into the hat not once, but twice for seats that were open on our Central District Health Board. Sky? Sky is a good friend and one of my next door neighbor and one of my favorite horsemen. And I've learned a lot from him, and I value his friendship. I value his training and his expertise, and I value his support for our community. Dr. Blue, on behalf of the Ada County Medical Society and the entire medical community, the patients of the Treasure Valley, thank you for your efforts in making Idaho a healthier place, especially during COVID. We present you with the 2021 ACMS Physician of the Year Award. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now on the agenda was a list said if I want to have a few comments, and certainly won't pass up a chance to do that. First, my thanks and my gratitude. Thanks to you, thanks to the board, thanks to our society. Being recognized by your peers is truly an honor. So I want to reach out and say thank you to that. But I'd also, during this last year and a half, 2 years, I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you to my family. Janet, Olivia, Bibi, who were able to enable me to be able to do what I've been able to do during this time. But I also want to say thank you to my colleagues and my partners. This isn't about me, and I would not be here if it wasn't for a great group of physicians that I work with. We truly inspire me and push me to be a physician who I am. It's been quite a year. It's been quite 2 years going on. A new disease, a new process that's kind of been forced upon us. It's unprecedented. It really is. It has now surpassed in death count that of the 1918 influenza pandemic, which we would only read about and think about and really try to envision what it might be like. With this new disease, the institutions, the experts with their guidelines, the years of clinical trials that would give us the evidence base to tell us what to do, missing. You know, the national coordinated strategy with the states and local institutions that would help us along the way, missing. The technology, the tests, the PPE, the supplies that we need to do our job, missing. And into this gap, you know, I'm proud to say the medical community here in Ada County, are the hundreds, thousands of providers stepped into that gap because we had patients in front of us. We had patients being admitted to the hospital. We had patients that needed us, so we stepped into that. And it really says something when individuals are ready and willing to step into that gap. So I am grateful for this honor, but I really only accept it as a part of that community, part of the physicians and the countless nurses and medical staff who every day go to work and go home, wondering what more could we have done today to help out. Wake up the next day and despite the fatigue, go back in and do it again. You know, with that uncertainty, what is it going to mean? Am I going to get sick? What's going to happen? What can we do? But increasingly, even with a hostility, which is hard to fathom, you know, the ED docs, the hospitalists, the intensivists, every single medical specialty, the nurses, the caregivers, who just day in and day out. You know, I accept this award on everybody's behalf. Those of us who stepped into the gap when our communities needed us, because we're there. But we don't do it for the recognition. We do it because that's what we do. That's what a healthcare provider is. And so to everybody out there who is seeing this and it fits with who you are as a provider, every little bit everybody is doing is going to get us through this. And on all your behalf, thank you for this recognition. You know, keep doing what you're doing. We don't do it for the recognition. It's just what we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Sky. Very well said. One of the things our foundation through ACMS does is give a $500 contribution in honor of our Physician of the Year to the local medical charity of their choice. Sky has chosen that this year SNAP, the Safety Net for AIDS program, will be that recipient. We'd like next to turn the rest of our evening over to our keynote speaker. I want to point out on your Zoom screen that there is a place for you to pose questions during the talk. Just press the Q&A button, type in your question, and we'll try and moderate those questions at the end of the presentation. Right now, I'd like to invite former ACMS board member, geriatrician, Dr. Kara Kuntz, to introduce our speaker since she was so instrumental in bringing him to our conference this evening.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's my absolute honor to get to introduce Dr. Karlawish today, as I am most passionate about dementia care above all things in medicine. I came to know Dr. Karlawish because I was participating in the AGS annual conference and heard a keynote address mention his book that you're going to hear me mention more here in a moment as a must read. I immediately started reading it and agreed, and I tweeted about it. And Dr. Karlawish responded, "Send me an email, I'd love to hear more." That conversation prompted him being here to join us today to share his insights with us about dementia. And I'm so excited about this. Jason Karlawish is a physician and a writer. He researches and writes about issues at the intersections of bioethics, aging, and the neurosciences. He is an author of The Problem of Alzheimer's: How Science, Culture, and Politics Turned a Rare Disease into a Crisis, and What We Can Do About It. He also wrote the novel Open Wound: The Tragic Obsession of Dr. William Beaumont. He has written essays for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Forbes, The Hill, Stat, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. He is a professor of medicine, medical ethics, and health policy, and neurology at the University of Pennsylvania, and co-director of the Penn Memory Center, where he cares for patients and lives in Philadelphia. Please, Dr. Karlawish, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you. And here I am. I assume I'm on screen and coming through on audio. Until it tells me otherwise, I'll believe that. Greetings, everyone. Greetings from my home in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It is my deep regret, that I am not joining you from a podium in Idaho. I really look forward to coming there, and I really regret that I can't be there, but I fully understand why I can't be there, and I hope you all are doing well, and my colleagues and I are very much thinking about you. I want to thank the Ada County Medical Society for this invitation, and I want to thank Kara Kuntz for reaching out to me as she did and as she told you. It's a thrill to hear from readers. As part of being an author and having a book out there is to put it out there and then see how readers react and respond. And so you too could be readers, and I would encourage you, please drop me a note. I want to congratulate Dr. Sky Blue on his award, and congratulate all those who he congratulated on behalf of his award. And I will say that this talk that I'm going to now give is inspired by him and his award. It's a talk I've never given before about this book. And it's 5 stories about physicians, the first of which is me. Imagine a healthcare system incapable of diagnosing whether increasing numbers of older adults with weight loss, vague pains, and anemia have cancer, and if they did, incapable of treating their cancer and caring for their common complications such as pain and fatigue. That's the problem confronting older adults today in America with memory loss. The system is broken, and a correction is needed to remedy this. It begins with creating a workforce. Simply put, there are millions of people living with Alzheimer's disease, but not enough doctors to take care of them. I am one of those unusual doctors. I didn't start out as an Alzheimer's doctor. After my residency in internal medicine, I was a fellow at a prestigious critical care medicine training program. But after a year, I dropped out and I switched to geriatric medicine. For 3 years, I was the only fellow in the geriatric medicine fellowship program. Critical care, in contrast, trained a full cadre of fellows selected on the basis of a highly competitive computer-run match. What happened? Friends from medical school and residency asked. Their tone suggested suspicion that I'd been kicked out or committed some egregious misstep. What happened was the healthcare system killed my grandfather. My grandfather was a reasonably healthy 90-year-old man, save for dementia. His internist never offered a clear diagnosis of the cause. The family managed as best we could, making sure he was cooking meals and helping him to take care of his bills. No question, his daughter living on the other side of town kept him going, but then he fell in his kitchen and fractured his right hip. The ambulance took him to one of the nation's leading academic medical centers. There, he was cared for by a retinue of clinicians at the top of their training, equipped with the best of technologies. Everyone did what they were supposed to do. Sure, there were a few missteps or near missteps, such as the surgeon who strode into the room to announce he wasn't eating, and so needed a nasogastric feeding tube. She held the skinny rubber tube before my father, who explained that he'd just fed my grandfather his lunch. With assistance, he could eat. She turned and fled, never to be seen again. Everyone was doing what she thought she should do, but no one was working together. It was the best of care and the worst of care. It was uncoordinated care. It was a medical funhouse run by madmen. Something was really wrong. I needed to change my profession. That was 1994. Alzheimer's wasn't yet widely recognized as a national crisis, but the hospitals were full of elderly men and women, like my grandfather, with families at wit's end. And yet, it was hard to assign a cause for the spectacle of well-funded disorganization and deprivation. We were citizens of the richest nation in the world, being cared for in some of the finest medical centers. Something was very wrong. But what was it? In the United States, funds to care for patients are driven by payments for prescriptions for surgical and drug treatments. Alzheimer's care is in the awkward position of not having a comparable business model. The richest nation in the world does not have a viable market to support this care. Simply put, a clinician cannot make a living as an Alzheimer's doctor because the reimbursement from insurance cannot support a physician's most essential resource, time. To be able to ask, what's the problem? How can I help you? And then take the time to listen. And so now my next story of my 5 stories. In 1999, Dr. Peggy Knoll learned this painful truth. The first geriatrician in Asheville, North Carolina, she was 10 years into running the Center for Older Adults at Tom's Rehabilitation Hospital when she received very bad news. The center was closing. She had 1 year to find a new job. 20 years later, I interviewed her about the events leading up to the closure of the center and the wild risks that she took in response to this near collapse of her career. Her center saw older adults whose multiple illnesses were a complex web of social, medical, and financial problems. Her practice used the principles of geriatric medicine to solve their problems. This involved, for example, assessing the patient's typical day. The visits, as a result, routinely involved not only a patient, but also a family member. And they took time, as long as 1 hour or more, nearly triple the time for a typical new patient visit with a general internist. As she and her colleagues set to work, something started to happen. Well, I thought I'd be taking care of all types of geriatric problems. About 9 out of 10 people who came to see me came with dementia. The Center for Older Adults was transforming, she explained, into a memory center with a model of care much like the Memory Center where I practice at the Penn Memory Center in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The problem she faced was her business model. Most memory centers are run by researchers like me, based in an academic medical center. They rely on cross-subsidies from generous philanthropy and research funds. We divide our attention between research and care. Hers, in contrast, was run by clinicians based in a community hospital and dedicated simply to taking care of patients. They relied on the revenue from clinical care, which meant funds collected from billing Medicare. The hospital, she explained, had been cost-shifting the income coming in from nursing home care and hospital consults to cover the aging center, but then there was one of the Medicare budget acts that took away the ability to cost-shift. What followed was accounting that allowed the hospital to cover the losses of her clinic. That ended. She hunted for cost savings. She offered to take a pay cut to fundraise. Her colleagues tried to see more patients, but this poorly reimbursed care only worsened the center's losses. The center closed. That was 1999. Dr. Knoll was out of a job. She had 1 year to find a new job, but she decided to persist. And in persisting, what she did was set up her own memory center, freestanding. She would charge Medicare a little bit for the patient care. She would charge the caregivers a separate, distinct fee for the counseling and support that they received. And she would fundraise. And despite all odds, nevertheless, she persisted and it succeeded. And today you can go to Asheville, North Carolina and visit memory care, where there's a team of 6 physicians, 3 social workers, and a nurse. They make home visits, and they've expanded now to 2 rural settings. It's one of the only freestanding memory centers that's not a research institute or a clinical trial shop in the United States of America. Dr. Knoll's story is inspiring. She took a big risk and she succeeded. She beat the odds, but her story is also sad. Over the years, healthcare institutions have come to her to learn about her model, and among the few who have tried it, most have failed. It's simply too hard to make budget. They set up programs, she explained to me, but as soon as the funding that came in from the outside ran out, they pretty much killed them. Or they decide we have to change the model, so you need to see patients every 30 minutes. The experience of running a memory center, though, has transformed her. One of the things about going through what I went through is a thoroughly profound sense of independence from any one system, which is the crux of the Alzheimer's crisis. We're bound up in a healthcare system that cannot or will not care for persons with Alzheimer's disease. For decades, it hasn't paid for the hour-long workup in a doctor's office that ensures an accurate diagnosis and plan of care, or care in the community to ensure well-being from day to day. The Adult Day Activity Program is the exact same treatment that has been wanted by caregivers since they founded the Alzheimer's Association in 1980, and yet families still struggle to find those kinds of services and supports. Which takes me to my next story. A hip fracture, complicated by delirium, killed my grandfather. Delirium describes an acute onset of confusion and disordered thinking, a kind of acute brain failure. The victim's alertness waxes and wanes. Some are lethargic, others, like my grandfather, become fiercely agitated, tearing away at their catheters and intravenous lines. Delirium, whether lethargic or agitated, has a core feature. People who know the person well insist the person is really different. For patients with Alzheimer's disease and other diseases of the aging brain, such as Parkinson's or Lewy body disease, delirium and hip fracture are the common culprits in a sad story of how, in an instant, someone who was doing reasonably well, despite these diseases, became terribly ill. In a sense, hip fracture and delirium are to Alzheimer's disease what a heart attack is to heart disease, and pain is to cancer. The end is either often profound disability requiring moving to a long-term care facility, such as a nursing home, or, as is the case with my grandfather, death. In the weeks following Dr. Sharon Inouye's first month as an attending physician, she experienced a career-changing revelation. The healthcare system had a big problem, and she was part of it. The attending physician that leads a team of doctors in training, a mix of medical students and residents and interns training to become internists. The work is busy and it is emotionally intense. The 25-year-old geriatrician was responsible for overseeing the care of as many as 45 acutely ill patients on the medical service at the United States Department of Veterans Affairs West Haven VA Hospital in New Haven, Connecticut. Her dominant emotion throughout that month was anxiety. In an interview 34 years later, the events that created those emotions were as vivid as the April when she lived them. "The buck stops with you," she recalled. At the end of her month, she realized that she was dropping the buck not just once, but at least 6 times. Something had really gone wrong. In that extremely busy month, there were 6 patients she didn't know how to care for because the problem that made them so ill was unlike any of the other common problems her team cared for. Every other patient, I felt confident. Heart failure, diabetic ketoacidosis, lung disease, stroke, anything like that, throw it at me. I can totally deal with that. But I had these 6 patients who were cognitively intact on a mission, and they became acutely confused on my watch. They came in with common problems she was quite skilled in caring for, problems like pneumonia and heart failure. Each one of them, however, suffered in ways that were vast and disproportionate to those problems. 2 went to the intensive care unit, 2 died, and 2 left not to go home, but to a nursing home. It was like, oh my goodness! They were wildly confused and did really poorly. Dr. Sharon Inouye needed to figure out what happened. What caused these patients who, though bothered by long-standing memory problems, started out alert and conversant, but then became wildly confused and disoriented, to time and to place. So she set out to discover what was causing those patients to become wildly confused. And she discovered that much like dementia, the late 20th century, delirium was simply accepted as just part of what happened. That just happens to older people when they come to the hospital. There's nothing we can do about it. There's nothing to discover about it. It's just what happens. Nevertheless, she persisted. She began to audit epidemiology classes at Yale University. She reviewed the patient's charts in great detail, assembled all the facts that she could possibly put together to try to understand what happened, what caused their problem. But her problems, though, soon multiplied. She pursued epidemiology training, but her mentor, the eminent physician and epidemiologist Alvin Feinstein, dismissed her research proposal, explaining that he couldn't think of a topic less interesting to anyone than older people becoming confused in the hospital. And also, there was nothing to be done about it. Mind you, this kind of judgment from a person like Alvin Feinstein was crushing. He was a titan. His approval launched careers, and his dismissal could end them. And yet, she moved on. She tried other topics, and still he would dismiss them. And finally, she returned back to her first idea and simply told him, Alvin, this is what I want to do. What she ended up doing transformed how medicine and society understand hospital care for older adults, especially older adults with dementia or mild cognitive impairment. Dr. Inouye would put together a series of studies that would understand the causes of delirium. She would identify the specific risk factors, much as epidemiology and other sciences identify the coronavirus as the cause of pneumonia. And she would identify those risk factors in a paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine called Precipitating Factors for Delirium in a Hospitalized Elderly Person. She discovered 5 noxious insults and events that followed hospital admission that independently conspired to cause delirium. Physical restraints that kept the patient from moving about. A urinary catheter that also restrained the patient and also increased the risk for bladder infection. Adding 3 or more medications, among the most common being psychoactive medications, especially medications for sleep. Low blood protein suggestive of malnutrition, and finally, harms from things doctors did, their various diagnostic procedures and treatments. These 5 things were the precipitants of delirium that caused those 6 patients when she was attending to so catastrophically fall apart. 10 years of meticulous research had transformed what had been dismissed as just another downside of being old into a diagnosis. Clinicians had a method called the confusion assessment method, a tool to easily detect delirium, and now knew the matrix of events that explained why delirium happened. And Inouye, though, was still not done. It was all very well for a researcher to describe the world. The goal of a doctor, like Dr. Sky Blue, is to improve it. One more study was needed. She ended precipitating factors for delirium in hospitalized elderly persons with an idea. All 5 of these noxious insults and hospital events, they were modifiable. These were the targets of intervention. 3 years later, the lead article of the New England Journal of Medicine reported how a multi-component intervention reduced the risk of developing delirium from 15 to 10% among those who developed it, and reduced its duration. An accompanying editorial praised the study as myth-busting. The devastating confusion older adults experience in the hospital was not like the winter, something that just happens, but the consequence of a cascade of events, and like polio, they were preventable. The Hospital Elder Life Program, or HELP, was born. But in the years to follow, the Hospital Elder Life Program, a program designed to reduce delirium in older adults, struggled through a rough transition from a brilliant idea into standard of care. The reason was the healthcare system. HELP wasn't a prescribed medication treatment for a defined disease, and Medicare wasn't designed to rigorously support preventive interventions, especially an intervention as both complex and as simple as HELP. Complex because to learn it requires studying a set of 6 binders and 6 training videos and inculcating it throughout a hospital. Simple because each of the interventions is just that simple. A glass of warm milk instead of a tablet of Ambien at night. HELP wasn't a pill with a business model to propel it into practice. It was a way of thinking and a way of behaving. It was culture. It's hard to change culture, even when that culture is causing people to suffer and die at the hands of the healthcare system. Unless, of course, that healthcare system is losing money. Which takes me to my next story. It is the story of Doctors Bob McCann, Daniel Medicine, and Stephen Cates, who joined the Pantheon with Dr. Sharon Inouye and Margaret Peggy-Knoll. After 12 years of practicing geriatric medicine, Dr. Bob McCann knew a number of valuable maxims. One of them is a hospitalized older adult is a kind of canary in the coal mine. If you can make a hospital safer and more user-friendly for them, it will be better for everyone, young and old, he reflected. And if the hospital isn't safe, these are the patients who sound the alarm. He told me this as he was recounting his early years as chief of medicine at Highland Hospital in Rochester, New York. In 1999, when he started the job, the older adults being cared for there were sounding the alarm. Highland, founded in the late 19th century by homeopathic physicians, was a community hospital, and McCann was among its new leaders, brought in by the new owner, the University of Rochester Medical Center. McCann recalled repeated calls from the director of the emergency room. Something was terribly wrong. Older adults were coming in with fractured hips, but no one wanted to take care of them. The doctor in the emergency room would call medicine and say, we've got a person with dementia from the nursing home who's on 20 medicines and is delirious. And medicine would say, we don't accept fractures, call orthopedic surgery. And so they'd call orthopedics and they'd say, oh my God, admit them to medicine. Each patient instigated a constant back and forth over who would have charge of an acutely ill older adult with dementia and a broken hip. The longer the patient waited in the emergency room, the sicker she became, and the clinician's approach to caring for her became more and more risk-averse. The anesthesiologist insisted on a cardiology consult, and the cardiologist then ordered tests, and so surgery was further delayed. Fluids were limited so as to avoid heart failure, and now dehydrated patient developed worsening kidney function. As a result, once safe doses of medications became toxic doses. Not surprisingly, delirium often ensued, and as it did, antipsychotics or sedative medications were prescribed, and so they became even sicker. Mistakes were building on mistakes, were building on mistakes. Modern American hospital is chock full of technologies, some of which are capable of generating breakthrough tallies of revenue, and yet its financial viability can be summed up in by the use of one simple and prosaic item of furniture, the bed. The metric of a successful hospital is that every bed is always filled. An empty bed means no patient is being billed, no technology is being used. When McCann took over as chief of medicine, Highland Hospital had 261 beds. On any given day, only about 60 of them were filled. The institution was at least $10 million in debt. He recalled how it felt like the hospital was going to be mothballed at any minute. This was an opportunity to try anything, something to save a failing institution, and the people in charge were the right people to try. McCann recalled the turning point. It was after a conversation between one of the orthopedic surgeons, Stephen Cates, and a young geriatrician, Daniel Mendelsohn. They had a unique approach to care for patients with hip fracture. They worked together. One day, Mendelsohn recalled, Cates opened up to his young colleague, Daniel, what's it like when you have to work with an orthopedic surgeon? That's different than me. What followed was a mutual confession. I said to Steve, well, to be honest, sometimes it's like pulling teeth. We don't talk the same language. The surgeons don't seem to have the same interest as you, and the patient outcomes aren't really as good as they could be. And Steve said to me, well, would it surprise you if I said the same thing happens when I have to work with a different medicine doctor? No, Mendelsohn admitted. It wouldn't surprise me at all. What followed was an effort by Dr. Mendelsohn and Cates and McCann to engage in an honest reflection about what they were doing and what they were failing to do at their hospital to care for these very ill, very sick, frail older adults with hip fracture and delirium and dementia. And what they did was put together a hip fracture program. And it was not a program that involved any massive technological interventions. It was a program that involved taking stock of what they were doing and failing to do, of listening to each other, of listening to all of the disciplines who had charge of the patient care from the moment they arrived in the hospital to the moment they left the hospital, and of seeing that there were things that they could do better, like, for example, Sharon Inouye's HELP program. And in time, 8 years later, with the assistance of a researcher trained in epidemiology, they set out to study their program. Their once upon a time failing community hospital compared the outcomes of their hip fracture care to the hip fracture patients cared for at the flagship academic medical center that owned them. Patients at Highland were older, they were sicker, more likely to have dementia compared to those receiving usual care at the flagship hospital. The outcomes of their care, however, were uniformly better. The Highland patients stayed fewer days in the hospital. There were fewer patients with infections or blood clots. There were fewer cases of delirium. As Highland turned around, Mendelsohn fastly recited how these numbers add up to everyone's benefits. You've improved the patient's outcome and experience, you've improved the staff experience, you've improved the surgeon's experience, and you've improved your bed utilization. When you shorten length of stay from 7 to 5 days, you're getting about 1,000 bed days back. 1,000 bed days are also worth a lot of money. Remember, in a successful hospital, every bed is always filled. Bob McCann knew the program was working because the alarm stopped sounding. He stopped getting calls from the emergency room saying, "We've got someone that no one will take." Which takes me to my last story. Lean, bearded, and modest, with a preference for blue blazers, Dr. Jeff Kay is the stereotype of the usual male neurologist studying Alzheimer's disease. His ideas and approaches, however, are most unusual and quite revolutionary. In 2001, 13 years into his career as an Alzheimer's disease researcher, Kay experienced a career-changing aha moment. It came to him during a lunch break at Alzheimer's in Technology, a conference hosted by Intel. Jeff said to his table mates, "Why don't we use technology to better understanding of what's really happening instead of this artificial layer that's been going on for decades or even centuries?" The artificial layer he was referring to was the well-trod routine of studies done at Alzheimer's disease research centers throughout the world. The large, years-long cohort studies that followed a group of older adults. As he explained in an interview 18 years later, the approaches researchers used in these studies in order to understand Alzheimer's disease and the other diseases of the aging brain have a fundamental limitation. You see somebody, you interview them, you get all their self-report that you can, and you have to believe it because what else are you going to do? You do some cognitive testing, you see them for a brief period of time, and then you send them home and you wait. And then you do the same thing, and you do this year after year after year. And then you try to connect the dots. This approach, he decided, was too removed from the day-to-day lives of older adults. He and his colleagues weren't really studying the disease, they were studying their representations of the disease. His table mates at the Intel conference nodded. The young neurologist had a good idea. Kay returned from the Intel meeting to his office at the Oregon Health and Science University's with a plan. He was going to disrupt OHSU's Alzheimer's Center's cohort study using new technology made possible by funds appropriated by Senator Hatfield. No more requiring older adults to come to his research center. He would go to them, gathering data in a manner that was as passive and unobtrusive as possible. Instead of asking a subject, for example, to fill out a form to report how often they went out of their house in a typical week, a door sensor would record each time the subject opened the door. And so too for moving around her home, traveling outside her home, even sleeping. He launched what came to be known as the platform. What Dr. K developed was a method to use remote technology to monitor a person's daily life, how often they left their house, used their computer, when they drove their car, and when they drove their car, how fast they went. Did they cross through red lights? Did they go too fast in speed zones, etc.? Real world functional data, which he would show would correlate with measures of disease severity, of atrophy even of the brain, in a way that was compelling to suggest that this technology could track the disease in someone's real life. So Jeff K, Dr. Jeff K, Dr. Sharon Inouye, Dr. Bob McCann, Dr. Daniel Mendelsohn, Dr. Stephen Cates, they're not rejecting the biomedical model, but each one is recognizing how our approach to Alzheimer's disease ought to be more all-encompassing. Clinicians are part of a social ecosystem that we can manipulate to achieve the same kind of outcomes of care we desire from a biological treatment. This approach will address the overcorrections of the late 20th century, when the biomedical crowded out more psychological and social interventions. A rebalancing among the biomedical, psychological, and social models will allow us to achieve a more complete understanding of what the problem is and how best to treat patients and their caregivers. What these folks engaged in is what I like to call a non-judgmental process of reflection and self-discovery to arrive at not just knowledge, but a willingness to change themselves, or what one would call discernment. A willingness not just to discover the world, but to change oneself. And so I'll wrap up with my last story of one final physician. In 1987, the Associated Press published Guardians of the Elderly, an Ailing System. The special report was the biggest investigative effort in the history of the near-century-old newswire service. 57 Associated Press reporters spread out over all 50 states in the District of Columbia. They traveled thousands of miles to nursing homes, shacks, condos, cow pastures, and courtrooms. They interviewed hundreds of judges, lawyers, social workers, doctors, court clerks, and academics. The lead story's disturbing headline of the 26-page summary report read, "Declared legally dead by a troubled system, the AP had uncovered a national scandal." Guardianship describes a legitimate legal procedure to protect an adult who can no longer manage his day-to-day life, such as after a devastating brain injury that causes a persistent unconscious state. A judge decides a person needs a guardian and then appoints someone to serve in that role. The AP had uncovered a graphic, systemic, and nationwide scandal. The array of harms and indignities they reported included failing to even tell the person that guardianship was being pursued, short and perfunctory court hearings, and abusive guardians who, for example, raided the property during the war for their own personal gain. The findings were so compelling that Congress held hearings and formed a select committee on abuses in guardianship of the elderly and infirm, efforts that led to reforms to state guardianship laws and a model guardianship law. Among the potential hurts, one stood out. The core of guardianship is a judge's decision that a person is not competent to manage her day-to-day life. To make this important decision, judges often rely on the testimony of medical professionals. The Associated Press story showed that physicians possessed little, if any, skill in determining that a person can make day-to-day decisions. In other words, a judge might just as well have decided whether a person was competent or incompetent using the outcome of the flip of a coin. What would follow would be the work of a young psychiatrist named Paul Applebaum, who would collaborate with lawyers and legal professionals and judges to develop a method to assess decisional ability, to decide whether someone was capable or not capable of making decisions. And if not capable, across the variety of life's decisions, perhaps needed a guardian. It was highly creative, inventive work made possible by a grant from the MacArthur Foundation. The list of corrections that I've been talking about is long and complex, but my point is simple. It's possible to reintegrate the biological, psychological, and social so that patients and families can live well and with dignity with Alzheimer's disease. The stories I told you of Dr. Sharon Inouye, Dr. Peggy Knoll, Dr. Bob McCann, Dr. Steve Case, Dr. Dana Mendelsohn, and Dr. Paul Applebaum are inspiring tales like Dr. Sky Blue, of physicians who persisted despite the odds, despite what people said well, you can't do or you shouldn't do. And it's been the story of Alzheimer's disease since the beginning of the 20th century, when Dr. Alois Alzheimer's defied ideas of what causes a brain disease and said, I'm seeing things under my microscope that just aren't what I would expect. They're just not aging. There's some disease going on here. And in my book, I narrate how that work, so revolutionary as it was, came to a grinding halt because of the social and political destruction of Germany beginning in 1940 and ending by 1945. So the problem of Alzheimer's is truly the story of how science, culture, and politics transformed what was a rare disease into a crisis and then rapidly turned it into a common disease and then rapidly turned it into a crisis. Fortunately, though, I try to lay out in the second half of the book what we can do about it. I thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to you. I look forward to having some engagement and question and answer with you. If you want to know more about me and who I am, you can visit my website. The address is there. If you're one of those folks who does Twitter, by all means, join me on Twitter. And I open it up for discussion now. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Karlawish. And again, I want to thank our sponsors and our partners once again. And thank you all for our questions. We have a couple, and it's on a smaller screen, so I can't hardly see it. Dr. Karlawish, the question that we have here are behavioral and objective measures used by the OHSU physician in your second to last story being used in studies of the new biologics that reduce amyloid plaques.
Unfortunately not. Unfortunately, still today, clinical trials rely on come into the center, get cognitive testing, have someone else fill out some measures of how you're doing, etc. I'm not saying that that kind of data are bad or wrong, but they're not that real world kind of data that reports how real humans are functioning in their real world. So in summary, it is unfortunate that those kind of measures have not been integrated into clinical trials and are not part of standard practice.
Okay. Another question that we have is listed here. Early in the COVID pandemic, when someone reported that someone they knew had died, the first thing that would be asked was, how old were they? That somehow, if they were older, somehow it was less of a tragedy. What are your thoughts about the approach and what would be different if Alzheimer's disease predominantly occurred in young people?
And also if most caregivers were men.
Yeah.
Because I think if Alzheimer's disease mostly occurred in individuals who are younger, and if most caregivers were males, I think our nation probably would have taken more action sooner and more aggressively. But as the questioner points out, many of the patients are older, and most of the caregivers are women. oftentimes a daughter or daughter-in-law. And I think that one of, but not the only reason why the disease has been under-recognized and has not had the kind of attention that's needed to be paid attention to it is because of those cultural consequences related to aging and related to matters of gender and the family.
I couldn't agree more. We have a question on, and maybe asking you to comment on the relationship of diminished endogenous anabolic steroids in age and the onset and progression of Alzheimer's. And I do think you mentioned some of this in your book.
Well, the struggle of the disease, Alzheimer's disease, as told by the advocates, was to differentiate it from aging. And yet, of course, it is a disease of aging. That is to say, the more chronologic years you have, the more likely you are to develop dementia caused by diseases like Alzheimer's, Lewy body disease, vascular disease, TDP-43, etc. And I think the field now recognizes we need to rethink the relationship between the changes that occur, quote, with aging, whatever that means, and disease. And the questioner's point is very provocative, namely, with aging, we see clear changes in a variety of hormonal functions, anabolic steroids, etc. It's still if you will, question under research, along with, for example, the changes in our metabolism and uptake of glucose. I saw another question about diabetes type 3 as a way to explain Alzheimer's. I'd walk away from that rhetorical phrase, type 3 diabetes of the brain, and simply say, yes. I mean, I think the more we study Alzheimer's, the more we see a variety of possible mechanisms that could explain why neurons die. One of which is our brain's ability to use glucose, which is the only food the brain uses. Another I'll put out there is inflammation. One of the cells in our brains is called astrocytes, which are inflammatory cells. They're neglected in the study of Alzheimer's, and yet those who look at them find there are real changes in astrocyte function in individuals who are aging, and especially in individuals who are developing cognitive impairment. So a lot of hot lines of research here, interesting areas of research that I think offer a lot of opportunities.
In terms of the new pharmaceutical that's been approved by the FDA, the aducanumab, you had talked a lot about in the book, its release was not necessarily based on clinical improvement in patients' quality of life or longevity of life, but more on a metric that was being measured in terms of amyloid deposition in the brain. There are many drugs, I believe, in the pipeline looking at Alzheimer's disease management in the future. What do you think are going to be some of the new drugs, and are you hopeful that the new research that's being performed is going to allow us to eventually be able to treat these individuals at a much earlier stage?
Yeah. Simply put, I am very hopeful that we will think of Alzheimer's disease and the other diseases that cause dementia the way we think of hypertension and cancer. Early diagnosis and intervention, even before you have metastatic disease, have had a heart attack or have had a stroke. I think that is a very possible future for this disease. I don't think that this drug aducanumab, as currently studied and currently labeled by the FDA, is the breakthrough that we hoped for. That's part of a larger story around some of the sort of slipshod processes that unfolded at FDA in a desperate effort to get something out there. You can go to my website and read more about that. I have a whole section under the writings page about aducanumab. But I think we should expect that we will develop treatments, diagnostics and treatments that for some patients do slow the progression, delay the time before disabling cognitive impairments. For some, these treatments will be effective. For some, they'll be marginally effective, and some they will not be effective, and there won't be treatments available. But I think we should expect that. I think the aducanumab story shows us that even if you accept their data at face value as showing effectiveness of their drug in slowing progression, which I do not. I think more study is needed. The FDA approval was premature. But even if you accept their data with the most enthusiastic of interpretation, you would agree that what you're seeing there is a slowing of progression with an effect that translates into, it's hard to explain with this disease, but a few more months, it's hard to put a time on it, of delay before further disability. But that is, if that effect is true, that certainly is a start. I'll wrap up with this. There are several drugs under study using the latest biomarker measures to identify who's going to receive the drug that hold promise that we might make a dent in this disease, just as we've made a dent in heart disease and cancer. But let me remind you, for all the progress that we've made in heart disease and cancer, people still die of heart disease. They still die of cancer. And so I think the idea that we're going to drug our way out of this complicated problem, like the way we drugged our way out of polio, is just that. It's an idea. I think we're going to have to learn as a society for how we're going to have to learn to live with these diseases, with drugs, but also with other treatments that make these diseases livable.
I really appreciate you saying that. One aspect that I really was intrigued by in reading your book, and also in Dr. Yuli's book, is the focus on family and caregivers that you really embraced. And the fact that, living through a diagnosis of Alzheimer dementia, my own father a year ago, and learning to live with the fact that the caregivers that provided his care, primarily my mom and myself and my family, struggled with his not only diagnosis, but his management, particularly in the face of COVID. And he passed away last year. He didn't die from COVID, but he died because of it.
Yeah.
Because of the fact that we couldn't mount a care provision paradigm to provide for him in the senescence of his life. There are, innumerable discussions about paying care providers, or at least reimbursing care providers who step out of their profession to care for loved ones with this disease entity. Are you aware of any states or any programs right now that are successfully doing that?
Well, I'm so sorry to hear about your father. It's a loss that just reverberates. And sadly, you're right. The events of this last 18, 24 months were a sad natural experiment in what happens if you take away the ability of humans to care for other humans, whether that's in the community or in residential settings. And what you saw was we really need humans to take care of other humans. And if you take that away, people suffer, they die. And I think it's a wake-up call to all Americans, regardless of party and partisan and whatnot, to recognize that we're all in this together. And this is a common risk we all share, like we share the risks of extreme weather or a failing economy, and we have to manage this risk. And the way we manage a massive risk that affects everyone in variable ways is we all come together and we take it on. And the way we do that is we diversify the risk, we diversify the cost, and we need to sort of all pay into a little bit of a program for the United States to provide a basal level of support for the American family to cope with the years-long demands of caregiving, to build a system of caregiving services and supports, adult day activity programs that are widely available and accessible, because right now they're not widely available and they're not widely accessible. The few that I know in Philadelphia, many of them closed down during the pandemic, and they're not going to reopen because they weren't part of lucrative healthcare systems. They were just freestanding not-for-profits that struggled, even in the best of times, to pay their staff and pay their rent. So we can do this. You asked if there are any states that have done it well. States do this oftentimes through their Medicaid programs. Of course, Medicaid is a program that requires you to meet poverty levels in order to finally qualify for the services and supports. Some states have stepped in and said, if you have the need, we will provide. New York State is an example of that, for example. But it's very state by state. It's very dependent on revenue, etc. Unlike Germany, unlike Japan, unlike France, unlike many countries that we think we're like, we don't have a national system to support the American family. And the American family pays. You know, when people talk about how Alzheimer's disease will, quote, bankrupt America because of triple-digit billion-dollar annual costs, most of that triple-digit billion-dollar annual cost of the disease is the cost of caregiving. It's the cost of your time, your mother's time, to take care of your father, the time you could have spent otherwise earning money, the money you could have otherwise spent instead of paying someone else to provide the care. That money is lost. It's left on the table. It's no longer taxed for Social Security. It's no longer taxed for state income tax, etc. So will this cost us as a country? Absolutely, it will cost us, but we're already paying. We're already losing. We're already suffering. We just have to acknowledge it and face it head on, like the way Sharon, in a way, and all the other physicians I narrated looked. The disease is in front of us in plain sight. We just have to have the courage to acknowledge it and then take it on.
Well, you know, and I appreciate you saying that. As a nephrologist, I take care of patients who are burdened by end-stage renal disease and are on dialysis. And I have several family members that have been very creative in their ways to care for their family members who are currently on dialysis. And one of the mechanisms in place that I have in several patients that I care for is they've essentially defined their own certified family homes, where they are paid a direct stipend by the state of Idaho to care for their family members who are on dialysis with end-stage renal disease. And, you know, talking with those patients and their families, it's really fascinating how difficult that is. And the amount of certification that they need to go repeatedly through by the state, and the application process being as difficult as it is. I mean, when I first heard about it, I thought, God, that's awesome. We should do this for all of our patients that have family members that are caring for them, particularly those that are on home therapy, for example, home peritoneal dialysis or home hemodialysis. But at the same time, it's almost an onerous task. And I think, you know, in the trillions of dollars that our current government is starting to throw around in terms of infrastructure development, you know, part of that has to be not just, you know, free tuition and free daycare and free everything, but it's got to be care for members of families who have this disease. And I have not heard any of that in the current negotiations behind this disease. Have you?
There's a wee bit of so your point is brilliant, which is that caregiving, providing care, is as much a part of the infrastructure to support the American family as the roads we drive to get to work, as the buses we put our children in to go to school, as the schools our children go to be educated. And we have to acknowledge that as just as much an essential resource as those resources, and provide the adequate resources to make it possible. Because think about it. Suppose I was being paid to provide dialysis for a family member. So in lieu, I can guarantee you that pay would not equal the pay I would get in my work as a physician at University of Pennsylvania. So I get some low wage to provide that work in lieu of the work that I could do otherwise. And so you begin to see how, of course, families should coordinate and help to provide care where they can and want to, but you want a system set up that allows family to flourish as well. I have family members who have foregone work in order to care for their relative. Maybe they get a little support from the state of Pennsylvania to do that with similar programs like what you've described for in Idaho for people on hemodialysis. But those wages are far below the wages they could earn at their work and are not paying into the tax system as well. And so in the end, these diseases become economic problems. Has the conversation in Washington addressed this as forthrightly as it should? There was a mention of it in the Biden platform when he was running about giving better compensation for, quote, the formal caregivers, the people whose job is to provide care, because their wages are so low. But the conversation hasn't moved to the level that it needs to move, like what you've said. In Germany, they have a national social long-term care social insurance program. If you need help at home because of dialysis, spinal cord injury, dementia, help can be provided to support the family. You get a little more payment if you're a family member, so as to encourage family to provide care. But if the family member doesn't want to provide care, you get a little less support, but you still get some support to offset those massive losses of finances that occur over years and years of providing care. So countries have done this. They can do it. This is not some wild, wacky, unusual program. And I don't think of Germany as a socialist nation. I think of it as a pretty good liberal democracy like ours. We just have to muster the political will to come together and do this.
I agree. I agree. Steve, are there any other comments or questions in the queue?
Just the comments here from Tiffany Robb. She's the state director for the Alzheimer and related dementias program that was just funded by the state this year.
And okay, so Tiffany Robb comments that it's $54 a day for payment for family members within, I perceive, a certified family home, and that 70% of Idahoans are providing care are also working a full or a part-time job. And, I mean, that's what we're facing in terms of, not only this disease, but many others where family members, as you pointed out, spinal cord injuries, post-trauma, post-ICU care, et cetera, where the family is being called to now be instrumental in caring for their loved ones who are in recovery or in a declining phase of whatever illness they have.
Yeah. Oh, well pointed out, Tiffany. Thank you. Because, look, especially for Alzheimer's, you do want the family involved because these are diseases of the mind. These are diseases of identity. And you need that family member's input because they understand the mind and the identity of the other person. And when I say family, I say it broadly, family, friends, etc. And so this creates kind of a tragedy for the American family. They know they should do this. They know that only they can do this. But why don't we support them in the effort to do it? And I'm speaking personally. My father has mild stage dementia, and courtesy of the wealth he earned, not a lot, but enough, I can pay other people to give care to him. I orchestrate it, I oversee it, etc., because I know him well enough to know what they need to do. But I think, by God, for the average American family that doesn't have the income he has and the fortunate luck that I'm an Alzheimer's doctor for him, how they struggle. And that's just not acceptable. And I think we can change that.
Well, thank you so much for
Thank you.
tonight, and I look forward to someday meeting you in person. As you pointed
Yeah,
out,
I'd love to get out there.
Experience, not a 2D, and hopefully we will be able to invite you back at one of our future events when things quiet down.
Yeah.
And thank you again for offering your prose in your book, and I really got a lot out of it myself, and hopefully other members of our organization who signed up for the presentation tonight will get an opportunity to read the book, and I encourage all of our members to do so because it's a phenomenal work.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Drop me a little note if you had a chance to read the book. Love to hear from you. Bye-bye.